Hello, everybody. This is Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate for president in 2020. And this Green Socialist podcast is about continuing to advance the program that we ran on. And the other guy on the screen with me is Mark Dunley, longtime Green. He's head of the Ecoaction Committee of the National Party. And he just was the lead organizer for one of these COP26 coalition demos. There were 200 around the world. We just had one in Albany, New York. And I'll just say a few words about mainly on that theme and what's going on with Build Back Better and the bipartisan infrastructure bill and where we are on the climate issue. And then I'll let Mark talk about the Ecoaction Committee and the climate issue, and then we'll take questions and answers. So I think the first thing we have to understand is that the bipartisan infrastructure bill doesn't do much for climate. It does provide for some charging stations for electric vehicles, which we'll need, but far from what's needed. But it also has $25 billion a year in additional fossil fuel subsidies. We're already giving that industry $20 billion a year. So we're going the wrong way. And while Biden is in Scotland, Glasgow at the COP26 conference, making promises about methane and stopping deforestation, which we've heard before on deforestation, he's also sitting on his desk is the ability to stop 23 natural gas projects, 20 pipelines, and 3 liquefied natural gas export facilities that he could stop. And if he did that, if those projects go forward, it's the equivalent of 400 average sized coal plants. So, we can complain about China building a coal plant a week. Well, we really don't have a position to complain until we get our own act together. So, what I told the people there was, we really got to move from fossil fuel capitalism to eco-socialism. And that's what the Green New Deal is about. I've run 3 times for governor in New York since 2010 on a Green New Deal, for president on an eco-socialist Green New Deal. It's an emergency program to get to 100% clean energy in 10 years. Originally, we wanted to get there by 2020 and 2010 when I first ran on it. Really, the science said that what we had to do, but it is going to take some time to rebuild our energy system. So we give it a decade. So now we're looking at 2031. And it also has to provide the economic bill of rights we talk about: a living wage, an income above poverty, affordable housing, quality health care, lifelong public education, and a secure retirement. Because if we're going to build the kind of coalition that can win the climate program, we got to mobilize the people that are struggling economically and build a majority winning coalition. So we've run on the Green New Deal and argued that, well, we can affect the world by setting a good example, which it will do. But things have changed since I first ran in 2010. The proportion of emissions coming from the poor global South is up to almost 2/3, which means even if the rich countries get their own act together with their own Green New Deals, we still got a problem. The planet will be cooked unless we help these poorer countries make the transition. And they're building coal plants, not just China, but it's India, Indonesia, Vietnam, South Africa is terrible on coal. Brazil is destroying the rainforest. So what we need, and this is what I was talking about, is climate reparations for a global Green New Deal. And now a lot of these emissions in the global South are embedded in products we import. As a rich country, we import a disproportionate share. Wood products from the rainforest, burgers from the cattle that take the place of the rainforest and graze, usually for a short period of time till the soil is depleted. And then they put in these palm oil plantations, which are destroyers of biodiversity as well as poor at securing carbon. So, I mean, it's got so bad in the Amazon that the Amazon's now leaking more carbon than it's absorbing, which is a big problem. And while we import products, only about 10% of the production in the global South is imported by the global North, the rich countries. 90% is for domestic markets. So we got to be concerned that they make a transition like we do. And that's where the climate reparations come in. And people say, well, how do we get Americans to pay reparations to these other countries? Well, it's really an investment in the habitability of the planet, which we're concerned about, as well as people in the global south who are getting hit the hardest. So that's the way we should look at it. It's an investment, not just paying off a debt. And the world community, you know, back in Copenhagen COP, in it's a Council of the Parties. What is it, Mark? What does COP stand for? Council of the Parties. I'm reading lips. You need to
Conference of Parties.
Conference of Parties. Yeah, parties being the nations of the world, the states of the world. In Copenhagen, they said we should set up a green investment fund for the poor countries. Took them 2 years to commit to trying to raise 100 billion a year by 2020. A year, 100 billion a year, and they've only raised a little over 10 billion in total. So it's been a joke. And that's what you got to watch out. These countries will make promises, they don't follow up. And if, you know, the U.S. contributed its fair share, there was a group of environmental groups, the Center for Biological Diversity, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and they said the U.S. should not cut just 50% like Biden pledged the U.S. would do back last April when he had some other countries in for a little climate summit. He really can't reach that with the climate policies he's put forward, but that's what he said. They said the U.S. should cut 70% by 2030 and 195% total. Well, how do you cut more than 100%? By helping these countries in the global south cut their emissions. And that's how you get to 195%, 125%. And they said to make that contribution, we need to contribute $100 billion a year. And people say, wow, that's a lot. Well, it's only 10% of the military budget. And if we made those contributions, we'd be the world's humanitarian superpower. And we're not making any friends being the world's global military empire. So that would be to the benefit of the whole country. So that's why we need climate reparations. And the other thing I'll say, and I didn't get to say this in the demo, because you know how they limit your time, and Mark runs a tight ship, so I could see him there giving me signals. So I had to cut this part, but it's not just enough to pay climate reparations. We got to change this exploitive economic system of imperialism that extracts value from these global south countries, largely through debt. So we got to cancel foreign debt. We've got to stop the money, the institutions they borrow money from, like the IMF and the World Bank, from imposing public austerity and privatization of public utilities and services. We need fair trade, not this exploitative trade and this secretive trade tribunals where only the corporations and the states hash things out. We don't even know what they decide, and they usually decide against the interests of communities and workers. And we need public ownership of key industries, energy, transportation, and manufacturing if we're going to make these reforms. So it's more than just climate reparations. It's really system change to stop climate change. So that's why we need to be paying more attention to the global situation. Of course, our first responsibility is to get a real Green New Deal in this country, get climate reparations paid, get a real program that we can work with these countries in the global south with. That's the most important contribution we can make. But I think we also need to find ways to be in solidarity with the movements in these countries of the global south that want a Green New Deal for their own country. Because, you know, take South Africa, for example. There is a climate movement there, but it needs solidarity and support because they're up against a power structure and the economy is dependent largely on coal in South Africa. And we can talk about other countries, Brazil, Indonesia, China, India. We need a global movement for a global Green New Deal. So that's what I was talking about today. And just the last thing I'll say is that, yeah, they got the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed, not much climate stuff in there. Most of the public spending on infrastructure is public-private partnerships and contracts, privatization, not so much through the public sector, problematic, and that deserves a whole discussion. But the big question is, will the conservative Democrats, there are about 7 of them in the House, and then Manchin and Sinema in the Senate, are they just going to say, thank you very much, we got our bipartisan bill through, later for Build Back Better, which provides needed social programs, the climate program we can critique, but the progressives have been making all the compromises through this whole process. And I'm afraid they might have just compromised their leverage away, and now they're going to get stabbed in the back. We'll have to see. They say they're going to vote on it the week of November 15th. We'll see. So that's as much as I'm going to just talk about what's been going on this week. And let me introduce Mark Dunley again. Mark is, he started the New York Green Party. He called me about getting somebody to run for president as a Green back, mid 80s? I wasn't ready for that, but
1988.
Okay, well, my answer was
White River Junction, Vermont.
That's where I was at the time, and so anyway, I've known Mark since then, and he helped form the New York Green Party, and now he is the chair of the GPUS Ecoaction Committee. So, Mark, why don't you tell me what that committee's been done and what its purpose is and what we need to do?
Well, I'm actually the co-chair. Dawn Marie Cronin is the other co-chair. The idea behind the Ecoaction Committee is that we help frame ecological issues within the Green Party, and also try to help the various Green Party candidates for local, state, federal office to be able to articulate sort of an ecological agenda. A lot of our focus this year has been to promote what you really started in 2010. I was your campaign manager in that particular race for governor, and that is a concept of an eco-socialist, Green New Deal. Obviously, in recent years, Democrats, AOC, Democrat-like groups like the Sunshine or Sunrise Movement have adopted the Green New Deal, nowhere near as ambitious or robust as what you had talked about started in 2010, but certainly none of the concept of eco-socialism, which is public ownership and democratic control, not only of renewable energy, but of the broader economic system. And one of the things I often say is that if Democratic politicians believe that the way that we're going to avoid climate collapse is by increasing market incentives so that hedge fund operators will build out more renewable energy, we're going to do very little to avoid climate collapse. And that building out renewables is good, but the bigger challenge is also to cut greenhouse gas emissions, which is saying, no to various fossil fuels, which is something that the Democrats, even Democrats like AOC, have a hard time, really, coming to grips with. And, we also say when we talk about, public ownership, it's also public ownership and democratic control. But, we need, not only do we have to put the common good ahead of the private greed, which is what capitalism is about, but you also need, democratic planning. We need to determine where do we need to put, renewable energy, not allow private developers to shop around to see where they can make, the most amount of money on. We need to take public ownership, democratic control, particularly the transmission lines, which is often a barrier to bringing on, new renewables. But even in this new framework by President Biden, as the sort of climate social spending package gets smaller and smaller and smaller, very much focuses on tax credits, which doesn't really help a lot of public ownership. But even when they give up a third of the funding to build out large scale utility renewables, besides not even requiring public ownership, they're not even requiring any form of public equity. I mean, that was at least something that AOC, in her sort of weak version of the Green New Deal, talked about if we're going to lend a lot of money to build this stuff out, at least the taxpayers should take some type of ownership, back. And we talked a lot about climate change, of course, with Ecoaction, but we also rights of nature, sustainable agriculture, various other environmental issues.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I want to emphasize is to get Greens into the action part. And I just neglected to say, what happened today in Albany. We had a coalition of groups come together, probably had about 200 people out there. And we started at a sustainability center in a predominantly Black public housing area called the South End of Albany, where there's a big project, $200 million project. And one of our demands is that that project hire people from the community and also involve them in dealing with the planning.
Yeah, if I just could give a little bit more elaboration, that is a project. The state finally, and I remember after your second raise, for some reason the governor Cuomo felt it was a need to talk more to the Greens after your 5% of the vote. And so actually we were in a meeting with them. And one of the things we were very big on is trying to promote the development of offshore wind, because the Mark Jacobson report had talked about 40% of the electricity from New York State should be coming from offshore wind. And we literally have to explain to the governor in the meeting how far out these offshore wind projects was. And he was actually a little bit stunned when he heard they were 12, 13 miles out. And he turned to the DEC commissioner and said, "Are they true?" And he said, "Yeah, they're right." And he said, "Well, maybe we should do more." But in any case, as part of this project for develop offshore wind, they gave $200 million to two projects, one at the Port of Albany in the South End and one in Sunset Park in the Brooklyn area. Now, if you remember this, somewhat weak climate bill they passed, the CLCPA, had a requirement that 35% of all new climate funding should go to benefit disadvantaged communities. And that probably was the biggest thing that new climate bill actually did. It actually was pretty weak on this other climate policy stuff. So we were saying $200 million for this offshore wind project at the Port of Albany. People forget the Port of Albany is an ocean port because it's on the Hudson River, so you can go directly out to the ocean. Well, that translates elementary school math, 35%, 200 million, $70 million of community benefits. Now, where exactly are those $70 million? We see maybe $300,000 of community benefits for some type of pre-apprenticeship program, which is good. It's a start. But, we don't see investment in the community. We don't see energy retrofits. We don't see the communities getting their housing stock. This is a poor Black neighborhood which literally has suffered more than a century of racial discrimination, starting with their housing and employment issues. And people really want this project to fulfill the vision that is in the climate bill, and that helps launch a reinvestment in the people, in this low-income community of color. And that's why we thought we'd start in the South End to sort of emphasize that what we're fighting for at COP26, what we're fighting for is the New York State legislature, what we're fighting in city councils and town boards and state legislatures is a just transition, and the concept that those who are most harmed by climate change, normally people of color, low-income people, should be at the front of the line in terms of getting the benefits. So just to give that little background, I'll let you continue about today's rally.
Yeah, and that bill, you're right. The good part was dedicating spending to disadvantaged communities. The implementation is another question, as you just described. The other problem with the bill is it says the goal of this bill is to get New York compatible with 450 parts per million in the atmosphere, which is, we're almost there now, but that basically means 60 meters of sea level rise, or 60 feet of sea level rise. We're going back to an era that's 2 or 3 million years old. It's not compatible with climate safety, but it's right in the bill because the fact is the bill was written by, it's a compromise between Cuomo and basically the Working Families Party. And these people really didn't, climate wasn't foremost on their mind. It was getting the money. And Working Families got the money for the disadvantaged communities, great. Although now they got to get it implemented. And Cuomo got a bill passed that didn't do that much, but he can say he did something. Of course, now he had other problems and he's gone. So that's what we're stuck with. But anyway, we went from the South End, where this issue, well, actually to another stop in the South End, which is the police station, where people spoke about police brutality and the link between racial justice and climate justice. And then moved on, marched down toward downtown Albany, stopped at the Chase Bank, which is investing heavily in fossil fuel projects around the world, and talked about that in divestment. And then we went to the federal building because
we stopped at the State Department of Environmental Conservation along the way.
Well, I must have been being interviewed at the time. Tell us about that. I was there, but I missed it.
Well, we added out in the last moment because we were going to have a speaker, Mert Simpson, who endorsed both you and me in one of our recent statewide campaigns, talk about, excuse me, the heating plant down the Sheridan Avenue, but he decided to meet us directly at the federal building. So let's swing over, and we, DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, is, the state agency that's most charged with, working on climate in New York. And one of the groups that stood up, and we added them to the agenda because we suddenly were at DEC, was this group called Lights Out Norlight. And this is a community about 10 miles north of Albany in a little river town called Cohoes, sort of working class, but has some wealthier parts because it's used to have a lot of hydro there. But in any case, in Norlight, basically is a hazardous waste incinerator. It started off, as often is the case, making aggregate concrete, sort of like concrete, not exactly, but part of the construction industry. But because they have a really, like a cement plant, they have a kiln that heats at 3,000 degrees temperature. They realize they can make more money by importing hazardous waste from literally all over Northeast United States and burning it. And surprise, surprise, literally across the street, across the train tracks, actually, there is no street, within 100 yards of that from these huge incinerator is a low-income housing project. And so we're trying to get this DEC to deny the permit. The permit actually has expired. It expired last December, and the company is dragging its feet going, for the renewal, because under existing law, as long as you have an existing permit, even if your permit expires, you can continue to operate until such time as they yank, the permit. But this is another classic environmental justice issue. Is low-income housing. I will say it's more mixed race, certainly Latino and African American, but also, fairly percentage of, low-income white families. And, so we decided to highlight that at the DEC stop. Then we went to the federal building and we got to introduce Howie Hawkins.
Yeah, and that's where we sort of rounded out a demonstration that we have 4 demands, which were consistent with what these COP26 coalition demonstrations around the country and around the world were about. One is we need sufficient mandatory emissions cuts to get us on a path that keeps us below 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in global warming. We called for climate reparations. We called for climate jobs and making that link between climate justice and economic justice. And we called for a just transition so that any worker that's displaced, any community that's harmed by the transition is kept whole through the process, so that we don't let the corporations say, oh, it's jobs and economic well-being versus the environment, which is their old, they've been saying that since I've been around, 50, 60 years, and we can't let them do that. So we got to build a coalition. So those were our 4 demands. And we had the local media cover it. So I think it was a good day of work, but we got a lot more to do.
Right. And I wanted to quickly go back to the point you made earlier on. I mean, one of the things about Ecoaction Committee is, yes, the Green Party is a political party, and you and I, particularly you, but we run for electoral office and we continue to run. But I think we both agree that the Green Party should also be more engaged in issue activism. Sort of taking our beliefs and then working both in the community and with other community groups, to try to realize that, and making ties with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the climate justice movement, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, movement. The Greens should have a real activist streak, and that's when the Greens first emerged in the West Germany in the early 70s. That activism was very much at the forefront, and they're involved both in fighting nuclear power plants and how we were losing our agricultural land to development, but also people forget that Germany actually for a long time was a colony legally of the United States, and that from the agreement from World War II, the United States, England, and Britain had a lot of control over their country, Russia and other parts. And the United States was deploying first strike nuclear weapons, cruise missiles, into Germany against Russia. And the Greens and others says, why are we arming ourselves with first strike nuclear weapons against Russia? We want nothing to do with it. And, that's when a lot of them discovered that they actually did not have any legal right that really had been ceded over after World War II to the United States. And that, was quite a big issue. And the other thing, the Greens were very, very controversial early on in the early 80s in Germany. They talked about the reunification of West Germany and East Germany. Was very much opposed by the political mainstream. And then as a flip, when that actually did occur, it was actually then the Greens that said, hold on a second, now that we're doing it, we need to take a little time to make sure this is a merger on an equal basis. But, just getting back to the point, we just think the Greens need to be doing more activism, and the climate movement and the Green New Deal, Eco-Socialist Green New Deal, is a good place to start. And also helping the climate movement make the connections. We're not going to get climate justice without racial justice and, economic, equality and single-payer health care. And, we need a different world.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat. Deborah Suso Oliveira talks about the Covantis incinerator in Newark causing, there it is, high asthma rates. Mm-hmm. People should know that in the so-called low carbon technologies that can get subsidies from Build Back Better, incinerators, waste incinerators are among them. Gas-driven, natural gas-driven buses, for example. Right. So it's not no carbon, it's low carbon. And of course, waste incinerators cause a lot more problems than just the release of carbon, right, as Deborah points out.
And I'll just mention, I actually did one of the first reports in the United States back in 1985 about the environmental and financial dangers of garbage incineration. On the environmental stuff, basically, I took a lot of information that had been developed by the California Air Resources Board and translated into English so that people can understand it. But at that point, pretty much every environmental group in the country was promoting garbage incineration. And I was like, what? And, incinerators are the largest source of a lot of the heavy metals in our environment. Chemistry 101, you burn paper and plastic together, and incinerators want to do that because it increases the temperature of the burn, which increases the efficiency. But if you burn them together, you end up getting dioxin, which was what Agent Orange is all about. And they not only cost a lot of money, but often the local municipalities end up signing agreements that they will deliver a certain amount of garbage to that incinerator. And if they decide to implement a recycling program which reduces the amount of garbage they have to send to the incinerator, they often would have to pay a financial penalty for doing that. So it was also a disincentive to it. And it was actually a very expensive way to deal with your garbage. Much better to deal with, basically the concept of zero waste.
Emil Sachs asks, I think the market incentives, quote unquote, praise goes back to Al Gore's bestseller, Laugh Out Loud. So many uninformed people still think Gore cared more about Earth than about making sure the rich could stay rich. And that he could get rich, because after he was vice president, his family had a few $1 million on a farm. Now he's worth well over $100 million from quote unquote green investments. So yeah, Al Gore's legacy is checkered at best.
And couple of things I remember about Al Gore. One was right before the Paris Climate Accord. Governor Cuomo of New York State, and Al Gore did this big, rally in New York City at Columbia University, where they patted each other on the back, and all the big environmental groups were there, and they said, "We are going to go to Paris, and we are going to fight for a limit of 2 degrees Celsius on global warming." And all the climate groups applauded wildly. And the reality is that the rest of the world was waiting there in Paris to say, no, 2 degrees is a death sentence for the planet, particularly for the global south. And they tend to be concentrated closer to the equator, whereas where you see climate change takes place more rapidly is at the extreme. So at the equator and at the poles and the Arctic. And so really it was Al Gore and Kerry and Obama who were fighting for 2 degrees, being applauded by the American climate movement, when the reality was the fight was to lower it to 1.5 degrees. And surprisingly, they actually got a compromise where they did keep it at 2 degrees, but said we should try to keep it at 1.5 degrees. And the IPCC's recent report have been very clear. We cannot survive 2 degrees. We must try to keep it to 1.5 degrees. And, that's really been a big focus going into thing. And the other thing I always remember after this guy, David Brower, used to be executive director of Friends of the Earth. Used to be executive of the Sierra Club. They fired him because he was too radical. And he founded Friends of the Earth. And he wrote an op-ed in the second election cycle. So that was in 96 with Gore and Clinton. And he wrote that Gore and Clinton in their first term had actually inflicted more damage on the environment in 4 years than Reagan and Bush had managed to inflict in 12 years. And he pointed out 2 things. One is Clinton had raised so much money from the corporations, for the Democratic Party, that he started paying them back by things like changing the rules for the sugarcane operators, which really devastated the Everglades, salvage timber rider in the forest, and of course doing the whole NAFTA World Trade Organization, type of stuff. And the other problem, besides Gore and Clinton doing so much to pay back their corporate donors, was that the big environmental groups would not fight Clinton and Gore. Whereas if James Watt and Ronald Reagan did anything, they had a 5 million piece mailing out the door the next day to fundraise off. But once the Democrat was in, they were like, oh, if we yell at them, they're not going to invite us anymore to those White House cocktail parties. We're not going to have access. And they felt it was more important to maintain access to the Democratic Party than it was to hold the party to task for being so bad on a lot of environmental issues.
Yeah, and Al Gore and John Kerry exemplify what Mark is talking about. Gore's dirty deeds go back to Kyoto, where they first tried to get some emission standards. That was in the 90s. So Deborah Sousa Oliveira, we need to repackage everything using biodegradable materials. We got heaps of landfills in every state in low-income communities. Yeah, let me say words about that, and then a few words, and let Mark talk about it. That speaks to the big problem of environmental racism. I was asked to write an article about that. It came out about 10,000 words. We'll see if it gets published. It's an academic journal article. And what I found reviewing the whole fight for environmental justice led by initially Black communities, and they brought in indigenous and Latino and Asian and people from the global South, is that there's a movement against it and they win occasional victories, but the overall environmental racism remains. And the way they call him the godfather of the environmental justice movement, Robert Bullard, who said at the beginning of this thing, environmental racism is a reflection of all the other racism that segregates and isolates politically and economically Black and other poor communities of color, who then don't have much power to fight back when they are targeted for landfills, hazardous waste, pipelines, and so forth. And I went through, 40 years of that struggle. And my conclusion was there's a movement against it, but environmental racism is alive and well. So this is a big issue. And that's dealing with the second sentence. The first sentence is, I'm going to kick this over to Mark, because plastics is a huge problem in terms of how we package people. And before World War II, we didn't use plastics that much. And it was not the problem it is today. So Mark, why don't you take it from there?
Well, I mean, a couple things. I remember 25 years ago trying to get New York State to pass what was called the Environmentally Sound Packaging Act. And, that was, if you are going to do packaging, of course, it's much better to use returnable, refillable, and then, third is recyclable, but the best is returnable, reusable. But, we tried to pass a bill 25 years ago to require any packaging to be made of recycled or, reusable material. More recently, in the last year, there was a number of states who considered doing extended producer responsibility bills, which everybody loved because they loved the title. And the concept is that we need to make those who produce the waste financially responsible for the disposal of that waste, which I think we all sort of agree with. But unfortunately, the bill that was floated in many states, actually passed in Maine, seemed to have a very heavy influence from the package industry. And they were actually going to set up these little councils in different states that would literally allow companies like Pepsi and Coke to write the regulations with respect to how we would do this. And my wife happens to run a group called Beyond Plastics, came out against it. And I know that she's convened a lot of national experts in the last 3-4 months. And so they're going to try to do a real extended producer responsibility. But, absolutely right. And one of the things here in, I live in Troy, New York. I live outside of Troy, New York. Troy, New York is home of RPI, where I went to. And so one of the companies that was incubated out of RPI involves mushrooms. And it's actually incredible what they're able to do with mushrooms. And they actually started off with mushrooms as packaging. And so the idea was to you grow these mushrooms and they would replace the packaging, little peanuts you get from Amazon and all these other companies. And now they expanded to 7 or 8 other different uses of mushrooms. So the extent you could, try to figure out that type of stuff, that would be great. And it has worked in Troy. I actually believe they're based in Waterville across the river now from Troy. But mushrooms is biodegradable packaging. And I think some of them are coming to our rally today in Albany.
Violet, at Content Boutique, there's a group in the Philippines that's turning plastic waste into wood-like planks for construction. Any thoughts? You want to start with that, Mark?
Well, I mean, if you have it, certainly I know people have used the planks for the construction. That's one good use of it. I mean, the best idea is not to produce the plastic waste to begin with. And Beyond Plastic, my wife's group, just wrote a report basically saying that plastic is the new coal, and what is happening is that as we are beginning to restrict what the fossil fuel industry can do, they're able to use a lot of the waste, particularly from fracking, as the means for producing a lot of plastic. And so very heavily, the fossil fuel industry is investing now in what they call these ethanol. I don't know if ethanol is a great right word, but these cracker plants to take the waste and to turn it into plastic. And very rapidly, the greenhouse gas emissions that's related to plastic production is rapidly catching up with the coal plants that we're taking off the line. So yes, the extent you're taking plastic waste and you're making it into planks or park benches, that's not a bad use, but you also want to eliminate the amount of plastic waste that we're doing. And what you especially want to avoid they're now promoting pyrolysis, gasification, chemical recycling, which is just another fancy word for incineration. And they want to, convert the plastic into some pellets or other materials that you can burn for fuel. It's another corporate greenwashing that unfortunately people, oh, it's new and it's different. And they use the word green. It must be good. They're not.
Violet asks, mushrooms or comments, mushrooms eat plastic. Well, they eat some plastics that are designed to be biodegradable, but there's real limits to making biodegradable plastics, which I know Mark's wife has written about, and maybe he can talk about that a little bit.
I'm not an expert on mushrooms eating plastic, I must admit it.
Well, what about the so-called bioplastics, the biodegradable plastics?
Generally, a lot of this stuff doesn't work, but I'm not, an expert on it. And I know one of the big urban myths is that you can recycle plastics, and that's just is not the case. I think it's something like 12 or 13%. The plastics, get recycled. And yes, we take our plastic waste and we bring it to the store and we put the plastic bags into the container the supermarket has. But, that's really not doing a good job. I mean, we have one of the things, the Green Party, actually in Brooklyn, we were the first group to hold a big event in New York City we called for a ban on plastic bags. Got very complicated, had to go up to the state level because basically New York City doesn't really have much power, but power they have is limited by the state government. And so eventually we had to go to the state, but we've enacted now a ban on plastic bags in New York State, step in the right direction. One of my wife has what she calls a trifecta. So it's to ban plastic bags, but it's also to ban straws, and it's to ban, straws at restaurants and also plastic utensils at restaurants. If you're getting, takeout, they give you all this stuff. And even when we call them up, and we don't get takeout all that often, but on occasion when we do, we'll say, and please do not put any utensils or straws into the bag. And they invariably do. We have banned, not entirely banned plastic straws in New York City. It's called straws on demand. We're concerned that there are individuals who have physical limitations, which might need a straw for them to be able to drink something. So, we left the option that you could go up and say, oh, can I have a plastic straw? And the answer would be yes, but that you would, not automatically be given it. No one knows the exact number, and so this is going to probably be wrong. But it's something like we give away 5 million straws a day in the United States, and 98% of them or something ends up as waste. We got to stop producing, all this waste.
Thinking about that last question, mushrooms eat plastic, and I'm thinking, no, mushrooms beat plastic. Mm-hmm. Because mushrooms can be raw material for all kinds of packaging that, is sturdy, kind of like cardboard or plastic, depending on how it's used. And then because it's plant origin, it is biodegradable. So there are natural enzymes in the biosphere that will break them down into raw materials for other organisms to use.
Yeah.
So that's one thing about mushrooms. They and you can look this up online. I don't have it, right on the top of my head what these different products are called, but they look, pretty amazing. And I've seemed to recognize some of them from things I've picked up at, takeout at restaurant and so forth. Luca Denouncer, is hemp plastic a good alternative or just as bad as conventional plastics? Well, I'll start out with this one. Hemp makes great cloth bags. It makes great paper, including wrapping paper. So why would you want to turn it into a plastic? I'm thinking hemp. See, before we used plastics, we used glass. We did use hemp before they got it mixed up with marijuana and banned industrial hemp, along with the version of that species that provides a lot of THC for marijuana. And that's really where we got to go back to instead of these. The problem with plastics is when they break down a lot of those chemicals, and they break down into microparticles. They're in all of us now. They're in the fish we eat. Goes out in the ocean. They break down in microparticles, get absorbed, move up the food chain, and they're disruptive to our endocrine systems, our hormones. Some of them are carcinogenic or mutagenic. They're toxic. So that's why we got to, basically get the plastic industry's got to be shut down. And it's an extension of the fossil fuel industry because that's the feedstock for most plastics. So anyway, that's my response. You got more to add to that, Mark?
Not really. I will say one thing. I'm not as good of a construction guy as Howie Hawkins. I don't know if people know that was sort of one of Howie's initial fields when he got out of college. But I was good enough. I literally built my own house with my own hands, and hands of about 150 friends or something. But during COVID, my wife sort of said, "Time for you to build a shed to clean up some junk around the house outdoors." And I wanted to be able to do it because of COVID, so that I could physically do it myself, which made it a little bit more difficult to build a shed out of wood. And so by myself, I really would need a second person or something. And so one of the things I discovered was that there is resins that are produced that actually resins come initially from organic. It comes from vegetables, plants, and they are, biodegradable. And one of the things I did decide to do was get a resin kit, for this tool shed that I constructed. And the only thing you could tell different from it being plastic was definitely the resin, organic resin, bent more. To be honest, I'm not entirely convinced that the plastic industry isn't trying to sell stuff as organic resin, but there are alternatives out there. But I do not know about hemp. My wife is the plastic expert. I just get to hear the discussions in the background and read reports, but I'm not an expert on plastics yet.
Clayton Allen Bew. Working class folks not from coastal cities might roll their eyes at the idea of straw plastic bag bans. Moreover, if they feel the left wants to take them away, how do you fight pushback, educate? Actually, I think that's kind of a stereotype of working class folks. Most of working class folks, I was a Teamster, I was a construction worker, they do care about the environment. And you're right, though. If you say we're going to take away your straws and your plastic bags, we got to say we got something better for you. Paper straws, that's recyclable, it's biodegradable. And plastic bags are floppy, they don't hold so well. These mushroom containers for your takeout or hemp bags for your groceries are better. So the way we push back is we say, we got something better.
Yeah, and I'll mention, I pretty much my whole career in terms of a paid job was doing anti-poverty work. Community organizer for Acorn, and then I ran a statewide anti-poverty organization in New York for 28 years. So honestly, I'm very concerned about the impact upon working class people and low income people. And actually, the plastic bag ban we did in New York had an exemption for people who are making purchases based on using either WIC dollars or SNAP dollars. SNAP dollars is what we used to call food stamp dollars. But I also remember when this became, an issue, I called up some of the groups I used to work with and said, hey, people are saying that poor people, are opposed to this bill. And, they said, actually, poor people are pretty insulted that people think they're opposed to this bill. Where do you think litter occurs in America? And it says, we get the most litter. You think we don't care about the environment? And you think we can't fathom the concept that when we go to the grocery store, we pull along 3 or 4 reusable bags with us, that we can't handle this, that we're dumb, or something. You can also do the cost arguments with them. I mean, reality cost plastic bags at stores are not free. You're paying for it. You're just not being charged up front for it. It's hidden in the cost of the, overall sales. But it also dramatically increases the cost of, your local solid waste program. And, one of the things in New York we found was that, all these plastic bags that end up, they can really mess up the recycling equipment and other solid waste equipment. You get those plastic bags into your machinery and they get caught up in the gears and are quite problematic. And it was also very interesting. I took a canoe ride down the Bronx River through the Bronx a while back when I was living in New York City. And the amount of plastic bags on the trees along this river was atrocious. And there was a couple places, just because of where the wind currents are, you come around and there'd literally be 300 bags, in this tree. So I have suspicion litter does occur in the Midwest. And I don't think it's a West Coast, Midwest, type of issue. Oh, and we also tell them, especially with the kids, you show them the picture of, the animals, particularly the turtles with the straw in their noses, and that freaks them out. Because, that's where they end up. They end up, and I think straws are like either number 1 or number 2 biggest source of plastic pollution or pollution litter on beaches whenever these, various groups do their, annual litter pickup along the beach to try to figure out, what exactly is rolling up on our shores. And plastic straws are right up there at the top.
Violet at Content Boutique, can you explain what type of privatization just got voted for yesterday in that bipartisan bill? Well, you can go through any of the categories in which they're spending. Let's just pick electric vehicle chargers on the road, which is one of the few things really could relate to climate. Those are not going to be part of a public utility that provides you the electricity and the technology to charge a car at cost for public benefit rather than for private profit. It's going to be a public-private partnership, which means the public pays and the privateers make the profits. So these are going to be contracted out, as is almost everything in this bill. And that's a problem, because the public sector can do a lot of this stuff more efficiently with more accountability to the public. And by more efficiently, I mean you can get more bang for your buck. And the public sector has got a bad rap because of decades of propaganda funded by the corporations, aimed at the general public with ideologues from sort of libertarian ideology. But that's not the case. And usually when they privatize a service, a public service, when they first put it out for bid, everybody bids low. They expect to lose on their first contract. But once they get that contract and they build their relationships with the vendor, a municipality or whatever, next time it's up for bid, there's not as much competition. Sometimes there's no competition at that point. The other people that might be the contractors say, well, they got it. Let's not waste our time putting in a proposal. And then they start jacking up the costs. That's the history of privatization of public services. So you look through that bipartisan infrastructure bill, look at all the categories of spending, and none of it, as far as I know, is for directly provided public services or infrastructure. Some of it will pay, actually, maybe for airports that are municipally owned or state owned. Trying to think what other categories are in that bill. I haven't looked at it with a fine-tooth comb. I have Build Back Better, which keeps changing. That's why I keep looking at that one. But that's the problem with privatization. I mean, the Build Back Better bill's got that as well, or did have it until it's in and out. Paid leave, that could be a publicly paid benefit, universal. Instead, they want to hand it over to insurance companies and make it a mandate, and then put means testing on it. Well, not the paid leave, but the other one is child care. Even some very mainstream senators like Gillibrand out in New York had a proposal for public child care. Instead, they want to contract it out, which means you got the whole thing we got in the healthcare system where you got to make sure they're qualified to get the contract. And then you got to, when the services are, when you put in the paperwork to get paid, the government's got to check you out rather than just running it straight through the government. Like the one thing that's not privatized is pre-K. They're going to run through the public school system. That's really the only public thing they're doing that hasn't got a pushback. And that's why I say this whole Biden agenda, there was some wild statements from people like Bernie Sanders that Biden's going to be biggest thing since FDR. But you look at the actual way these programs are being administered and who's getting paid, it's the same old corporate neoliberalism. And those lobbies that lobby for these kind of policies, they're winning the day in terms of the legislation. So I hope that helps. I wish I could remember more of the sectors in the bipartisan bill. I know there's money for roads, bridges, airports, electric chargers. Broadband. A municipal broadband is cheaper and more effective than broadband from these big utilities like Charter, who I have to pay them, man. It's an arm and a leg. It's one of my biggest expenses each month, almost as much as rent, just to be able to be online, have a phone, and have access to TV. So that's an area where the federal government could be encouraging publicly owned and accountable broadband systems, but they're going to build it with the private industry. They're just going to subsidize them to cover the areas they wouldn't cover before because they didn't want to put down the initial infrastructure. It's like electrification. Rural areas weren't electrified until during the New Deal. They helped them form cooperatives. This Build Back Better bill doesn't, not Build Back Better, the bipartisan infrastructure bill does not talk about building broadband cooperatives or, public utilities. It's all, we're going to subsidize the private industry already there to expand so it covers the people not now hooked up with the internet with a high-speed connection. So that's what I'm talking about. So the hour is up. I just noticed it went by fast. Appreciate everybody here being here. Mark, you want to wrap up with any, a few words about Anything else you wanted to say?
Eco-Socialist, Green Party United States. We have a Facebook page. People can follow us on that. Green Education and Legal Fund, gelfny.org has a lot of information. People should contact, as always, there are Congress people, there are other elected officials, the president, and say, we need to do more on climate. We need to be faster. We have to stand up to the fossil fuel companies. We need to really support public ownership, democratic control, of our energy system. And enough of this blah, blah, blah stuff. We need real results. The window to avoid climate collapse is rapidly closing. Certainly at this point, we're not going to avoid climate collapse unless something dramatically changes. Until Howie Hawkins is president of the United States, there's not much hope. 3 years.
Well, I didn't know I was running in 3 years, but I think when we get to the point where I could be elected, maybe somebody else, then we're making change. I wanted to say a couple things, and this kind of Mark did a segue for me in that people need to be out there and be active. While Build Back Better is shrinking, and a lot of the policies are questionable, I think we got to give props to the Sunrise Movement. In Biden's original proposal, the American Jobs Plan, he had $10 billion for the Civilian Climate Corps, which Sunrise has been pushing, provide climate jobs for young people. And at this point, it's got $30 billion. The rest of the bill is shrinking, but Sunrise has raised such a stink that they had to accommodate them. That's just to say, don't think when you go out there, you're just shouting to the sky and nobody's going to hear you. Particularly when you do things that the media likes. You got to have some kind of media hook and colorful. And sometimes when you're disruptive, or, touch people's conscience, like this hunger strike those young Sunrise people did. I got my problems with Sunrise. They're relying too much on the Democrats. The point is, action gets the goods. So don't sit there moping. Somebody was talking about how they might be depressed after the election. Well, and pointed out that they elected 6 people in, it was Connecticut, or I think it's Connecticut. Excuse me. Well, at this point, we know of at least 17 Greens elected around the country. We have over 100 elected officials. That can be replicated at a much larger scale because a lot of these local races have no opposition. They're at a scale where you don't need a lot of money. You just need to go out and talk to people. So I think, there's reason to think we can make a big difference. The other question I saw in the chat is, do we plan to have some indigenous people for events or guest speakers? Yeah, I've been talking back and forth with Winona LaDuke about coming on to talk about Line 3. And while we've agreed she will come on, we haven't been able to get a date. So I'm still working on that. She should be on in the future. Excuse me. So going back to privatization, the problem with the Civilian Climate Corps is they're running it through AmeriCorps that runs the vistas. Instead of it being a public agency that directly hires and conceives of the projects, they're going to put out requests for proposals from private entities, nonprofits, for-profits. And AmeriCorps' experience is that's been very wasteful. You get all this overhead like we do with our private health insurance system. And I don't know about you, but I've seen some AmeriCorps people, Vista people getting paid but not doing anything because their job was ill-conceived. Even if they wanted to, they sort of get paid and not much happens. So that's unfortunately who it's going to be administered through. So rather than it being a public service that employs people improving infrastructure and so forth, it's going to be run through AmeriCorps, which doesn't have a great track record in that respect. So that's about all I should say. We're getting 5 after 4 Eastern time. So Beyond Plastics, Mark's wife, Cynthia Inc., runs that. People were asking about that in the chat. So Beyond Plastics, Google that and you'll get a lot of information on plastics. So with that, thanks everybody for being here. And we'll see you next week. Next week, today I'm in Albany or near Troy for this podcast. I'm at Mark's house. Next week, I'll be in Brooklyn with a group of people from the Caribbean communities in Brooklyn. And I'm going to be on their podcast, and I'm going to have one of their people on my podcast. Probably Brian Figueroa, who was one of the lawyers for Abner Louima, if you remember that case. Police brutality, they sodomized the Haitian man. This is back during Giuliani time. So we knew about Giuliani being crazy and mean. He sort of became America's mayor after 9/11, but man, this guy was pretty bad when he was mayor, and that was one of the incidents. So look for us next week. We'll be there. We're coming to you from Brooklyn. Have a good week, everybody.